Okay, so let's try to get started. I think we're about up to 30 people, almost 30 people. So usually we have some people coming in as we get started. I just wanted to thank everybody in the club who's joined us on this. This is the first time, the first opportunity we've had to work closely with Lehigh University and the galleries at Lehigh University to bring together some kind of a program for you. We'd hoped to do this actually at an exhibition that's at the university, but COVID-19 got in the way. And so I've been working with Mark and with Stacy to put together something that was that could be provided virtually via Zoom, and that's obviously the event tonight. Just also be on the lookout that on June 23rd, Stacy and colleagues will actually be making another presentation this month about what's going on at the galleries this fall, and also to talk about some of the resources that the university makes available via their website and internet access. So if you guys we'll be sending out an email regarding the June 23rd meeting. It is on the calendar. It doesn't have a lot of details, but it is on the calendar. So feel free to go ahead and register, but we'll be sending out additional information hopefully later this week. So with that, I will pass this over to Stacy, who will get us started.
Well, good evening, everybody. Thanks so much for joining us. We're really looking forward to the presentation ahead, and we are excited about this new partnership with the Photography Club. I see some familiar names here, and we hope that you will visit the Lehigh University Art Gallery website. As Bob said, we were hoping to hold this in person, but unfortunately, because the galleries are closed, we have shifted a lot of our resources to our website. There are many great videos there, as well as recordings from past virtual programs that we've offered. So we hope that you will take advantage of those resources, as well as all of the works that you see here this evening are available through our digital collection on ArtStore. So if you visit the Lehigh University Art Gallery website, which is luag.org, you can navigate to ArtStore and view all of these images and research our collection. So we hope you'll take advantage of that. And please feel free to contact me at any time if you have questions. But with that, I'm excited to introduce Mark Wonsidler, who is our Curator of Exhibitions and Collections and who worked with our colleagues at the art galleries to put together this tremendous exhibition. So he'll be giving you a background of the artists and photographs that are included there. So with that, I'll turn it over to Mark. Thank you.
Thanks, Stacy. Hello, everyone. I hope everyone is well and safe tonight as we are juggling these many national crises that we seem to be surrounded by. And as Stacy mentioned, you know, the pandemic has really shifted the way that we are doing things at the art galleries and has driven a lot of our programming online. So it's good to be with all of you tonight, despite not being able to be together in person. So yes, my name is Mark Wonsidler. I am the Curator of Exhibitions and Collections at Lehigh University Art Galleries, which, if you don't know, is the art museum at Lehigh University. We have a permanent collection of almost 17,000 objects, probably a good third of which are photographs, and particularly contemporary photographs. So it's a really valuable resource, I hope, for and maybe increasingly so for all of you who are interested in photography in the Lehigh Valley. Before we went into online mode, my colleagues and I curated an exhibition called The Motion of Light and Water, which is at our Du Bois Gallery at McGinnis Hall. It's been up for the fall and spring semesters. And I hope maybe some of you had an opportunity to see it before we all went on lockdown. It's a collection of photographs that are drawn from the university's permanent collection. It was developed in conjunction with Professor Anna Chupa who teaches photography at the university in the Department of Art, Architecture, and Design. And over many years, she has worked with us to develop different bodies of photography that circle around different photographic questions or compositional projects or issues that she's dealing with her class, who are often new young photographers who are just finding out what it's all about. So one of the assignments that she gives them every year she teaches the class is to think about photographing water. And over time, we started to notice that there were quite a few photographs that dealt with the subject of capturing water in our collection. And those conversations in that class led to what became and is the exhibition that is currently trapped at McGinnis Hall, where none of us can get to it, The Motion of Light and Water. So I'm going to be walking you through some of the photographs in the show tonight, particularly from the point of view of the question of composition. When Bob and Stacy and I were talking about what we could discuss in this talk, Bob had the idea of bringing some technical information. You'll hear from him a bit later on, and he raised the idea of composition, actually, as an issue, of course, near and dear to the hearts and minds of photographers, and one that maybe you would all be interested in hearing about from the standpoint of a museum curator and an artist of a different kind. My background is primarily in sculpture as an artist, and then as a curator, I deal with our whole collection, which spans many different kinds of works. So I hope that this information will be useful to you as you think about your photographic practices. And I would be really interested in hearing from you about future topics that might be also of interest. So if people have ideas about things that they would like to hear more about from the museum, please reach out to us and let us know. So I'm going to start tonight with composition, and I thought I would start with this, this puzzling word, right? What is composition? And if we go to the root of it, we find that it deals with a few fundamental ideas that include ideas of putting together, of connecting, and of arranging.
Presumably, she's probably never gotten married before, or...
Oh, somebody's got their microphone on. Oh, okay. This is the adventure of doing everything on Zoom, right? So composition suggests that there are these parts, right? Parts of a photograph or an artistic composition of any other kind that are united through a couple of different dynamics, right? Putting together suggests combining, connecting suggests like what is the line from one thing to another, or what is the sort of like ligature. And arranging suggests that we can kind of take these things and move them around. Now it's different, obviously, if you're a painter than if you are a photographer. If you are a painter, you get to invent everything out of nothing, whereas photographers work with often what is in front of them in one way or another. So of course you can arrange objects for the camera, but in many cases, as you know, you're going out and kind of hunting or fishing for things that unfold. So we'll try to approach this from both sides and see what happens. But I thought I would just deal with a couple of basic ideas of composition that we find in the history of art. And the first one I wanted to start with is geometry. By which I mean the kind of underlying, underpinning, sometimes semi-invisible geometric forms that are running through visual compositions and which, if we look for them, we start to see everywhere and can't get away from. And in particular, I wanted to focus on two sort of extremes of geometric composition, thinking about geometry that is grounded and stable, and geometry that is dynamic and unfolding. So I thought I would start with this example from Jan van Eyck. This is the version of Chancellor Roland from 1435. And it is a remarkable example of stability in painting composition, right? But how is the artist actually doing this? I think you can feel it when you look at it. There's a tremendous groundedness and solidity to the figures and their poses, to their placement within the canvas and or panel, and the way that they kind of react to each other. But as you look deeper, you will see that the painter has used a series of geometric moves to create this effect, right? And the first one that I want to bring to your attention is this large kind of dominant triangle that grounds the bottom more than one half of the painting. And you can see that it's sort of connected to this tiny island or something in the stream in the background, and then connects to the lower corners of the painting. And you can see that this geometry, which is really about converging to a vanishing point in the distance, right? All of the lines of the composition converge essentially at that point. And that convergence is reinforced by the way that these lines in the tile formation on the floor exist inside of this triangle, and we'll start to see that it's sort of happening everywhere. You can see that this this is not just an imaginary triangle. You can see where the artist has kind of aligned the edge of the Chancellor's Bible here with the edge. The line of Christ child is also parallel to this triangle, and numerous other things that you may discover beyond even the ones that I've discovered. And then if we think about the other portion of the composition, we see that if we extend a triangle in the upper part of the composition, we find similar things like the angles of the ceiling, the incoming angel's wing, these other pieces there. Everything is leading us back to this one point. And the effect that this has is centrality and stability, right? The composition is kind of reassuring us that we are in some way anchored in the world, and it's an effect of kind of calm and solidity. And of course, that is amplified by the strong center line that runs through the middle. You can see it sort of bisects the central arc of the background three windows and kind of lands pretty much in the center here. And this just reinforces that sense of centrality. If we cross it this way, you can see the artist is reinforcing that through the position of where the chin and like the mouth of the Chancellor, and just below the chin of the Virgin Mary. It comes right across this line that's part of the window in the background, and again through our island. If we think about the actual center of the composition, it's a little bit lower, right? If we run strong diagonals from corner to corner, we see that there's this other location which pretty much lines up with the windowsill and just the bottom of the Chancellor's hand, again the arm, right through the arm of both the child and the mother. So So what we see is that the painter is just reinforcing and reinforcing and reinforcing these strong geometric lines. But they're not just any kind of geometric lines. They are, particularly this this triangle at the bottom is like, it's like a pyramid with an incredibly firm and solid base, so that that sense of groundedness, that sense of a thing that's not going to topple over or be easily displaced, kind of radiates through the whole composition. And we'll see examples of that through the photographs in the exhibition, as well as some contrary examples. I also wanted to point out that there is this, quite dominant sort of square that sits on top of the center line and kind of frames out the windows. Again, this is incredibly solid, grounded shape, right? Because all of its angles are parallel to the exterior of the frame of the painting, and it just, it sits there like a stable weight. Also, the way that he's arranged the figures, right? If you look at them, they are like this series of blocks with, again, another sort of stable triangular form on top of them. It's like the figures are mapped out to sit very, very squarely, solidly, and a bit awkwardly for human bodies, but it reinforces what's happening. So, so that's all well and good for a kind of grounded composition. I want to cut to another source. Here's Dr. Strange from the 1984 classic How to Draw Comics the Marvel Way by Stan Lee and John Buscema. This is one of actually my favorite texts on artistic composition. So don't turn your nose up at How to Draw Comics the Marvel Way. I learned a lot from it along the way, and I keep coming back to it year after year. And here, in an example of how to, from the perspective of Stan Lee and John, to improve your composition, they are leading us to think about how we can make our compositions more dynamic. Now, I don't want to really bring this idea as a value judgment, although I think in How to Draw Comics the Marvel Way, it is a value judgment. But in photography, there's an approach, and all the arts, there's an approach, which reinforces that groundedness, and then another approach which breaks it. You can see in the panel on the left, everything the figure is doing is aligned, unlike our Renaissance painting, with the edges of the frame, right? There are all of these strong verticals and horizontals. The figure is kind of squared out inside of this frame. He's in profile, all of these things. Whereas on the right, we have all of these strong diagonals that are breaking, or at least kind of contradicting the strong rectangular or square frame that is the outside. And this is what I want to talk about in the shift from diagonal to, from a grounded to a dynamic perspective. Here's another set of pages, and there's so many great examples of how through, and I think this is really applicable to the photography, how through moving one's camera angle, one might create these strong diagonal and dynamic relationships. I think this is a great example. Here, the figure is kind of like squarely in front of you, again, like very stabilized. It's like you were standing across from and like shooting a figure. Whereas in the contrary example, you can see that the figure has turned, the point of view has raised slightly, and we now get this like sharp diagonal here. The center of the head is here. The shoulders are like this. So there's every opportunity to transform one subject through positioning and framing and all of those things. So if you haven't read How to Draw Comics the Marvel Way, I highly recommend it. So let's see. So here we are, and we see it playing out in another Renaissance and later painting by Guido Reni. Here's Saint Sebastian, who's a good example of how a kind of contrasting and more dynamic form might be realized, contrasting the super stable Jan van Eyck painting. So you can see inside of it that what's emphasized is not a kind of even alignment with the corners and the edges of the painting, but one that aligns with the diagonals that are running through it, particularly this strong diagonal running in one direction. And if we think about this bottom point as a triangle and this top point as a triangle, we can see that unlike in Van Eyck's painting, they do not meet. Like there's no kind of comfortable meeting point for them. So they're always kind of teetering out of place. And if you'll notice that those triangles aren't even the most important figures in the painting, right? To the contrary, there are these kind of strong angular forms that happen here and here, here. You know, this is that line I'm talking about. And you'll see that a lot of what happens is that we're not receiving these like stable grounded triangles, but in fact, you know, things that are more like you know, things set on edge, diamonds or triangles, where the point is what we're balancing on. Like this loincloth, right, is a big triangle pointing down like this. The light of his torso is a big triangle coming down like this. And you know, and then the head is pointing this way. So so as you can see, that is causing, because none of these lines are sort of parallel to the edges of the format, it creates the sense of a thing that can't quite balance, or that is dependent on a kind of very precarious balance on its point. And you'll see this you know, through all kinds of compositions. So that being said, I thought we should look at some photographs. That's what we're all here to talk about. This on the left is a photograph by Laura Cohen. I think you can see immediately what how she is working with these grounded forms of geometry. There's a strong center line. There's the familiar, incredibly strong triangle that's formed by the elements. The unseen top of the table seems like it falls somewhere about here, which perfectly bisects the oval of the top of the basin. And so all of the geometry, you know, is just reinforcing the sense of settledness, and it creates a kind of strange, surreal, meditative framework that the photograph is operating inside of. And on the right, we have a different photograph by Marc Citré, but you, I'm sure by now, will also see the very powerful, good line, to pardon my drawing by mouse, it's not my tool of choice. But you can see that there are these huge double triangles in the back that are sitting on this very grounded horizon line. It's reinforced by this tree line up above. you know, the trunks of the trees are parallel to the edges of the frame. And we even have this sort of bonus triangle in the back that's all, or in the bottom corner that's also sitting on like a pretty solid base. You know, the effect, as you can see, is a kind of an interesting kind of weight that counteracts the kind of ethereal quality of this photograph. It's kind of like deceptively solid, considering how kind of luminous and kind of disappearing the trees are in the mist. I also wanted to show you an example of, so here's a Lou Stoumen photograph from 1940 of Times Square. And this one I wanted to show because it reminded me so much of what's going on in that Jan van Eyck painting with the double triangles, because there's this triangle at the bottom and there's a triangle at the top. But when you look at this composition, there's something about the way all these things meet, and the fact that that confluence is in fact like the fluid and moving part of the photograph, the thoroughfare of the streets, the moving traffic. It just breaks down on in that central point, somewhere around here, where it should be stable. It's like the two triangles are like collapsing into each other. I don't know if anybody can feel it, but it's like the whole composition is starting to kind of like slump into movement. So it's an example of how you can use some of the same tools to create some really different effects. So, and then here, in contrast, is this Fritz Henley photograph from 1970, which, as you can see, is just an explosion of angles, right? Nothing, you know, these figures do all of this work to not be squared up in any way, right? We have this here, this one, this is a strong one. This is coming through here. Oops. Around. This is happening. This is happening. Really, what we are seeing is what I was talking about before, is a kind of diamond composition in the middle of the arrangement of these figures, and where everything is just kind of like leading away and destabilizing. And the diamond, you know, inside of the square becomes that very precarious configuration. And tricky to catch, right? As you're trying to bring all that into focus. I think the challenge for photographers and for artists of many kinds is to bring this geometry inside your eye, right? So that it becomes totally internalized, so that when you are out and about fishing and hunting for images, though these things are always in the background of your mind. So another idea that I wanted to talk about in composition is the idea of counterpoint. And I wanted to show this composition by Piet Mondrian, the great abstractionist, as an example of what I'm talking about when I talk about counterpoint or counterbalance. In this composition, which is quite simple and minimal, we have a very large red square that is counterbalanced by smaller a sort of blue rectangle and a yellow rectangle, and some other white shapes that frame out the outer perimeter of this composition. And what's interesting, I'm sure, as you look at this, you will see the way that your eye moves between that red square and the way it's always being kind of like tugged by the yellow and the blue into a kind of ping pong action. And so the dynamic of counterpoint, as you can imagine, is one where if you think about a seesaw and a fulcrum, where something larger can be counterbalanced by something smaller, which has a kind of intensity of its own. So it's dialogue between those large and small parts, which create a kind of rhythm. Here's another example. Katsushika Hokusai's famous The Great Wave from 1830, where we see the enormity. Virginia. We see the enormity of the wave contrasting the potentially even greater enormity of Mount Fuji in the background, where we have something which is very close, which becomes large and dynamic, and something in the distance, which would be more dramatic, except that it's very far away. So there's a kind of push and pull of the large moving thing in the foreground and the small but monumental not moving thing in the background. And in fact, from our previous examination of geometry, a very stable form in the background and a very dynamic form in the foreground. So I thought it would be interesting to look at this Weegee photograph from 1940 along those lines. So I'm sure you can see some of the some of the underpinnings of this photograph, and of course its main feature is this hugely dynamic spray that's coming out of the fire hydrant hose that is kind of exploding across the left-hand side of the photograph. And of course, as we are training our geometric eyes, we see that the photographer has positioned that explosion kind of right in line with this incredibly strong vertical from the sort of architecture of the street, which kind of converges with these roof lines, and also what's coming in here from the other side, right? So that is, so there's this like this supercharged point, right? And then everything sort of exploding out of it. And it's a way that there's a kind of like compression that happens on this side and a kind of explosion that happens on this side that are in a dynamic relationship with one another. It's interesting, you know, in drawing, we would think of this as sort of like the gesture, right? But what's the biggest gesture that's happening in the photograph? And it's clearly that stream of water. But then there are all of these other things that are happening, right? There's the more subtle rhythm of the buildings and the interesting distribution of the many figures, which really get subsumed into this kind of big movement of the water. Another idea I wanted to talk about in relation to counterpoint is this idea of the void. This is I'm pretty sure this is by Ma Yuan from the Southern Song Dynasty. The other example I will show you is definitely his. Sometimes the internet is not always so clear about what is what. But apologies to Ma Yuan if this is not his. So in the Southern Song Dynasty school of painting, one of the notable features is that you often have things located in a corner and of a composition, and then there's a large area of void which holds the rest of the space. And that void can operate as mist or weather or something kind of dissolving into the background. But it does create this sort of counterpoint situation where the void is really the largest thing in the composition. And then all the way down here, we have the very tiny figure of this sort of contemplative monk who is in counterpoint to the large empty space of the void. And that's the kind of relationship that I'm talking about as a possibility in composition. Here's another example where we see that the void space operates again as a kind of mist that dissolves into the water of this duck pond where a few creatures are sort of swimming around. And it's held in place by this rocky crag and tree branches that are kind of jutting out. I guess what I want to draw your attention to is the fact that what is ostensibly the subject of a composition is not always the most important part, or necessarily the part that holds it together. Here is a William Witt photograph from 1948 of a nude reflected in a sort of pond of reeds of a certain kind, or plant growth growing up through it. And you can see that most of the horizon is essentially here at her feet, and most of the composition is the reflected space, and it's just kind of filled. There's like a greater density of sort of fronds up here, and then they're more scattered here, and we get the kind of rippled and distilled sense of the figure as almost as a ghost in this kind of void space. So you can see how concentrated the activity, or like the density, is up here, and how void-like and distributed it is as it moves toward the bottom of the photograph. And here's another example by Karl Struss from 1909, where all of the activity of the photograph is jammed into this sliver of composition of the edge of the boat, right? And then we get a bit of wave and like a large field of waves, of just sort of less dramatic waves, and then the sky and sort of hill edge up here. But you can see the way this density is balancing against this huge void, which is the rest of the photograph. So I guess what I'm suggesting is the possibility of a kind of radicality of composition, where you can ask something in your composition to hold a lot of the attention, and it can hold that attention against areas where not that much else is going on. There they are together. So another idea I wanted to address is rhythm, right? And rhythm is maybe easier to think about in terms of music than necessarily examples from art history. So I'm not going to show any paintings, but we'll see if we can kind of puzzle through this, and maybe I'll make some sounds or clap or something, and we can try to understand rhythm. Here's a lovely Todd Webb photograph of boats from 1951. And you can see that almost like a sort of musical score, he set up this very strong diagonal across the upper right-hand side of the composition as a kind of anchor, and against it, he's playing the rhythm of these boats and trees. We get this kind of like a 1, 2, 3 set and a pause, and then another 1, 2, 3, but it has a different character than these first 3, which are a little bit chunkier. And then another pause, and then pop, 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 pop back here, and then into the stairway, and then all of these bugs back here almost dissolve into like a steady sort of like tap, 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 tap. And it's reflected as well in the notes of these sticks or rods kind of sticking up through the water. And then of course the larger, heavier notes, trees on the right. So, you know, really what makes this photograph is that rhythm, right? The way that the objects are arranged, not physically by the photographer, but in the eye, of course, and by all of the forces of the world that conspired to put them there. So that's a lovely sort of rhythm. Here's another example by Michael Smith from 1982, which has a much more sporadic kind of rhythm, where the parts are not quite the same as they were in the photograph of the boats. Here we have this kind of sort of scattery rhythmic quality of these tree branches set against the heavier, solid, more like bass notes of these large stones, right? And then of course there's the reflecting water and everything that gets caught in it, all the kind of rhythm and ripple of all of that. And then of course I just wanted to throw in Lou Stoumen's Times Square again, because everything in this photograph is moving, even if it isn't actually moving, right? We talked about the cars before, but the patterns of the windows on the buildings are just so striking. Everywhere you look, there's a kind of rhythmic pattern happening, and there's a kind of cacophony of energy, of things kind of crashing up against each other between the rhythm of all of those gridded windows, which are sometimes in front of us, but then sometimes converging on an angle, and then all of those cars, they're just kind of like rattling by, and of course the what we talked about before, which is that like kind of fluid dissolving gesture that runs through the middle of the piece like a river, that causes it to just flow, right? So we're really in the flow with this one. And this is just a nice example from Fritz Henley again, where you have this, again, the idea of a very stable kind of background and a lovely kind of lumbering rhythm that's made up of both kind of hard geometric forms and the softer biomorphic forms of the animals. So those are some of the things that make up the rhythm. So as you're looking through your lens, I'm sure you're all very conscious of the rhythms that are unfolding in front of you. And then last but not least, I wanted to talk about some ideas of framing. And of course, framing is like, what what photographers do. So I wanted to talk about it in a slightly different way. Obviously, you're always thinking about what is finding its way inside of your frame. But I thought it might be interesting to think about internal framing, right? Different kinds of devices that can be used to, within the broader frame of the photograph or the painting, to set off particular areas. So here's a Giorgio de Chirico painting from 1913. And in it, we see that this very powerful arch on the right-hand side that is creating a kind of aperture in which these two palm trees are framed. And likewise, the negative of this archway creates this strong sort of square on the left-hand side that frames the statue, the reclining statue that is there. And another famous example, of course, Edward Hopper's Nighthawks from 1942, in which all of the figures are held within the strong frame that is set up by this trapezoidal, the corner bar, the light inside of it. So all of these shapes framing out the activity of the figures inside. So it leads us from the broadness of the street to the enclosure, to the light, to the sort of triangular bar, to the bump, 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 bump of the figures. So framing, can happen in a lot of different ways in photography. Here's a Kristen Kapp from 2005, in which she has positioned herself sort of very low against the water with this kind of looming part of a ship or something on top. This one reminds me a lot of Hokusai's Great Wave with Mount Fuji in the background, where the focal or the space of attention is really carved out by this looming form at the top, which kind of cuts off that part, the water at the bottom, which sort of cuts off that part, and creates this strong geometric form in the center that frames out this range of hills, and it looks like some city buildings in the distance. So there's just there's an energy created by those two things pressing against that that third thing and creating a very idiosyncratic aperture for us to look through and consider what might be the subject. Here's a lovely Ansel Adams that we have in our collection. We're very fortunate to have, in which he has, so you can see what's going on. Here is the sort of pond edge, and then everything below that is a reflection that we notice because there's this ripple in the surface of the water. So everything, not much is happening up here, and then everything is happening down here, and we get the mountain range and the rest of the tree that we can only glimpse the trunk of here. So he uses that reflection as a kind of framing device, and then within that frame, he sort of frames this ripple again as well, which is pretty cool. I wanted to contrast that with this Harold Halliday Costain photograph, 1935, which also uses a reflection, but here, harkening back to our earlier stable Renaissance geometry, it's created this very symmetrical form with the horizon in the middle, which, although is round and kind of circulating, is very, very stable. And it's like having two halves of a clamshell or something like that reinforce each other. So while Adam's composition is quite dynamic with this, the difference between the tree and the ripple contrasting each other, this photograph uses a kind of stillness and stability. So that is an interesting way to use these tools to very different outcomes. And then maybe last but not least, this Markov Grünberg photograph from 1953, in which he uses the light in the background to frame the silhouettes of these figures. There's this strong anchor of this kind of public sculpture or ornament on the left, and the dynamism of the fountain over here on the right, and this arc between them that sort of sets up this whole the frame really becomes this light shape, and the figures are allowed to be contrast behind it or in front of it. Last but not least, I wanted to circle back to the drawing comics, the Marvel Way, and the famous three examples of the worm's eye view, which we see in Kristen Kapp, where we're low and we're kind of looking up. The 1 point, or kind of it is 1 point perspective, but really we're at kind of like eye level with something we've seen in see about here and here. And then the bird's eye view, which of course we see famously in our, where'd he go, Stoumen, from above. So with that, I think I'll end and turn things over to Bob. But of course, if anyone has any questions or any things they're curious about, put your questions in the chat, and Stacy will direct them to us. But without further ado, I'm going to unshare my screen.
Does anyone have questions for Mark or comments? As in, it's not one of the photographs, but your counterpoint example I thought was really interesting because it also had the three complementary colors, which sort of created an interesting balance as well, right?
Yeah, I mean, this show is almost entirely black and white, so
right, yeah.
It's challenging to talk about color in it. But absolutely, that is a whole dynamic that I'm sure all of you are thinking about what color can do.
Yeah, that was an interesting part about watching the exhibit. We're going and seeing the exhibit. Is so much of it is in black and white. There are only a few color photos. So,
yeah.
An interesting sort of, and it made me look at it from a historical viewpoint, and not so much of a common way we do today with digital photography. So, yeah.
Two questions before you go on, Bob. Mark, you mentioned a book. What was the book that you recommended?
Oh, it's How to Draw Comics the Marvel Way. Wait, I think I have it right here.
And the second question,
a classic from 1984. And what was the other question?
The other question was, do we actually use any of these photographs in the exhibit, which we did? And
yes.
I would be happy to share a PowerPoint of the images that were included in this exhibition with participants today. And again, these are all accessible on LUAG's website through Art Store. So with that, sorry, I will be quiet. And if there are additional questions, please post them in the chat box and we will get to them in just a little bit. Thank you.
Okay. All right. So interestingly, not all, but a number of the photos that Mark discussed, I've used as examples in my own discussion, though my discussion is different. As some of you have participated with me, we've been talking about exposure. So I wanted to look, when I went to see the exhibit, I was trying to look at that from a perspective of trying to understand how the photographers utilized exposure in creatively creating the images that they had. And I also wanted to think about exposure and the subject of water, right? I mean, we all have to understand that water is unique, both in, it has multiple physical phases, unlike most things that we photograph, right? They're liquids, they can be still, they can be moving, they can be spraying, they can be flowing. So they have, both stillness as well as dynamic sort of aspects to it. They can become a haze. They create haze and fog, which can be important to our photographs, and they also can transform that back into liquid in the form of rain. And though I don't believe there was an image in this that contained the solid form of water, which would be snow and ice, those are obviously subjects that we're all familiar with. And what's also interesting about water, unlike many other substances, they interact quite dynamically with light. They reflect light. They can refract or diffract light, making rainbows and highlights and just a sort of atmospheric light. And they can be transparent, like glass in many ways, right? And so how we photograph water and get the sort of the creative expressions that we want out of those photographs, in large part or significantly depends on how we set the exposure for making those photographs. And I don't need to really go into a lot of explanation to this because, you know, everyone I believe on this call is a photographer. But you know, we have the exposure triangle. It's balanced, right? And the three elements are aperture, which is the size of the opening in the lens, allowing light into the camera. The larger that aperture opening is, the more light that's allowed in. We have shutter speed, which obviously, you know, determines the amount of time that either the film or the sensor is exposed to the light or to the image. And then ultimately, we also have ISO, which is the sensitivity that our film or our sensors have for capturing those images. And again, these all work together in a dynamic and balanced way such that if you open up the aperture, allowing more light in, to keep that exposure appropriate, you know, you either need to reduce the ISO or reduce the shutter speed, and vice versa. But besides just getting an appropriate, you know, exposure to capture the scene and, you know, in the fashion that we want, when meaning, you know, how dark it is or how light it is, these aperture settings have other creative effects, right? And shutter speed really can determine for us, especially in water. It can either freeze the motion or it can blur the motion. So if we're looking at that water is moving, right? We can take that and create a blur, which really gives you a sense of movement. Or in fact, we can almost, in a way that our eyes can't capture, take fast moving water and freeze it, right? Freeze it like fixing time, right? And get a view of that water and a view of the scene in a way that our eyes can never comprehend on their own. Aperture, as you all know, creates, you know, our depth of field, whether that be shallow or be large. And if we're using shallow depths of field, what we're usually trying to do is to bring attention to a single object or a small set of objects, and then creating also potentially a sense of depth. I mean, one of the challenges we have in working in a two-dimensional format is that we're often in that two-dimensional format trying to give a sense of depth, and having some things in focus and other things out of focus can create depth in our images. But you know, if we're going to do landscapes, or we're trying to tell stories, or if we're trying to show relationships between things that are in the foreground and things that are in the background, in those cases we really need large depths of field. And what that really means is we're going to be utilizing small apertures. What's interesting about this exhibit, I'd say a large portion of it would be probably fall into almost a landscape, or to I would say there are far more examples of things that had great depths of field rather than things that had shallow depths of field. Also, ISO is important. It's the facilitator of how we use shutter speed and how we use aperture, and it can also affect whether the image has more grain or more noise in that issue, or in that image. What was kind of interesting and forced me to go back and take a look at is, you know, we had within these images were images from 1890s, 1900, all the way through, you know, in the last 10 years, right? And so we were, you know, I would say predominantly looking at film photography, right? And because of that, and the age of some of these images, most of it was actually black and white. Well, if we look at film and look at it historically, right? Um, you know, film captures light by chemical reaction. It's that sensitivity of that reaction determines what would be called today the ISO of the film. And one has to understand that black and white film, you know, in the early 1900s, you know, was really, really insensitive, right? I mean, it evolved from you know, ISOs about 1 to 3, right? Ultimately to 6, 12, 24, 100, 400, 800. And that's in black and white film. Color film was far less sensitive. But, you know, and it was really the evolution of the speed of film, right, through the decades that actually facilitated the development of new cameras, especially as we went from you know, large format cameras on tripods to handheld cameras. And some of us still remember shooting film, and one thing you learned quickly was, you couldn't change the ISO like you can in the camera today, right? The ISO was set by the film you loaded, and until you were done shooting, you could load another roll of film. You couldn't change the ISO or the sensitivity utilized for taking those images. And obviously, these lower ISOs facilitated slower shutter speeds and large apertures. Sensors, digital sensors today, far more sensitive. We can change sensitivity image to image at will, and the ISOs, today run from 100 to 32,000 or higher. So, if we need highly sensitive sensors to capture the light as we use very fast shutter speeds or very small apertures, that's far more easily achieved with today's digital cameras. So I just briefly wanted to go through a few images and just briefly talk about them. I mean, the first one here, both of these images were ones that Mark brought up. The one by Fritz is, I loved the image, first of all. It also showed a really great depth of field. And I thought, I look at it, and to me, there's a bit of a question of what's the story being told here. So again, often images with good depths of field are trying to tell you a story. I mean, are these people crossing a river? Or is this people working the river, collecting things? To me, it beckoned and made me ask, what's going on in the scene and what's being captured. Obviously, the one by Harold Holliday, Costin, is a great landscape of a tree. And again, unique to water is this ability to reflect the image so that you really do get the balance of a tree, in both its normal format as well as reflecting out of the water. What was kind of interesting, often we're trying to take horizons and make them, not dead center in the middle, but in this composition, it works well because we have this symmetrical view of the tree, tree in the sky as well, tree reflected in the water. Next, I just wanted to make a quick comment also about the Ansel Adams image. The thing I found, interesting, historically, Ansel Adams was a member of what was called the the group F64 group. So referring to an F64 f-stop. So this is a very small aperture. You don't even find that kind of aperture on a handheld camera today. But they were available obviously in large format cameras. And these groups of photographers are really looking to utilize very small exposures in very large format cameras such that they could capture things in great detail, and detail all the way from from the foreground ultimately to the background of the image, right? And here Ansel Adams again captures the mountains of Yosemite. And what I found interesting in it, because you look at that image and it's quite clearly mountains, but I look at those mountains and I also see something that looks familiar to me. And in fact, I think that's probably Yosemite Falls, but it's actually upside down and in the reflection of the water. So, and as Mark talked about, the shoreline actually creates a nice framing for the image as well. I wanted to briefly talk about atmospheric water because it does create, fog and haze, which we find to be, incredibly useful in photography. Again, working in a two-dimensional format, and trying to create the third dimension. One of the ways we get that is moisture in the air creates a haze or an atmospheric light that one can give us a sense of depth. I mean, if we look at this shot of Paris by Todd Webb, I mean, obviously he's utilized a small aperture for this image, and it's got a great sense of line and again, rhythm as Mark described, but it also has a great sense of depth, and not because things went out of focus, but because the atmospheric water, creates an atmospheric light and haze that gives us a sense that as we look deeper and deeper into that image, we're moving further and further back into the scene. And then likewise, the one with the Baz, I think it's probably also shot, with a relatively deep depth of field. As you can see, the ladder's in good focus, and I think for the part that you can see that the trees are also in good focus. But again, we get a sense of depth as well as a sense of light because of the fog and the haze that's in the air. And those would not have been there if it weren't for the atmospheric water. Finally, pardon me, if you look at large apertures with shallow depths of field, this image by Arthur Rothstein of Champaign in California, I mean, it's interesting as a water piece because here you really see the transparency and also the ability to diffract light, almost like a lens, right? But if you look at it, you can see, okay, the champagne glass and the grapes in the foreground are in great focus, but it was quite clearly, you know, not a image taken with a large depth of field because the background of what I believe is probably the orchard is, you know, dramatically out of focus. And so utilizing a shallow depth of field, it really forces the viewer to look at and to focus on the champagne glass and the surrounding grapes in the foreground. So let's briefly talk about shutter speed. Obviously, slow shutter speeds tend to capture motion, especially for water. And here, you know, we can see, you know, whether it be a stream. And what's interesting about this image of the stream to the left is that almost the entire image is one of motion. It's only the people that have some sense of stability, though they're moving a bit as well. So it creates a very dynamic feel to it by allowing the water to you know, provide an image of motion, of movement with people standing in it. As again, a sense of movement, but yet in a different context, the image of the horseshoe falls, quite clearly we see the water with a sense of strong movement and even of a splash within the pool that's collecting the water down below, but then the surrounding environment around it is quite stable, right? And so we see this sense of, rather than motion everywhere, a sense of motion of water, you know, what is a beautiful and stable background. And just wanted to getting more, maybe a little bit more technically, you know, what's interesting is that especially as one looks at the early days of photography when people were using ISOs of 1 or 3, right? Obviously, that didn't facilitate high-speed photography. So if one were photographing moving water, utilizing those kinds of restrictions, one was almost forced to use, right, slow shutter speed or long exposure photography with the streaming of water. And we can see that here in the Mountain Cascades of Europe by Charles Mitchell to the right, which was taken in 1892. So that's probably using film of like ISO 1 or ISO 3. And then, you know, also even in modern photography, you know, of more contemporary photography, shooting in low light also is basically very conducive to doing long exposure photography. And so the fountains, the stone flower fountains that Mark discussed, that flowing water was almost a natural sort of long exposure photograph for making that photograph. And again, it captures not water, you know, captured in spray, but rather the streaming of water from these fountains. You know, as the counterpoint to that, though, you know, capturing moving water and freezing it, right, almost in an unnatural way, also creates a lot of interest and dynamic sort of feeling to it. And here the image by Peter Turley in Cuba of children playing, and I'm assuming this is a wave that's crashed into a wall and sprayed the children, right? Creates a real sense of sort of the fun and the excitement and the emotion of that moment, which in my mind, with a longer exposure would not have even come close to capturing that same sense of energy. And then finally, I wanted to talk a little bit about creative exposure and how we can even see it possibly, you know, in images from a long time ago. Give me a second to take a drink of water. Thank you. This is by James Rich, and James Rich was at first a amateur and then ultimately a professional photographer in the Philadelphia area. And this image was taken at Holly Beach, which is actually near Cape May on the Jersey Shore. So if I look, just looking at this image, first of all, I loved it. It really struck me. But it seemed, I kind of looked at it and go, how did he do this, right? Because if you look at the image itself, the lighting of the image seems like it's almost in low light, right? But yet at the same time, again, anticipating he's using a very slow film speed, something around ISO 3, the waves don't seem to be overly blurred. They seem to be pretty well frozen. And the depth of field, is really great. I mean, up to the forefront of in the foreground, the ripples in the ground to the, what is, the sun or the moon coming up over the horizon in the sky, everything seems to be sharply in focus. And so I've got, from a technical viewpoint, almost a conundrum here in that I've got small aperture, I've got fast shutter speeds, and I have low light. And with an ISO, with an ISO 3, how in the world does he make that image? And as I thought about it and looked at it, the conclusion I came to is he creatively used exposure. I think, we're probably looking at a morning sun coming up from the east near Cape May at Holly Beach. He's shooting directly into the sun, right? So he has a very bright scene. But what he's done is he's actually taken that image and underexposed it probably by something like 6, 7, 8 stops, right? So he's, and so instead of being a very bright scene, suddenly that scene appears to be almost like a moon or, rising on the horizon, capturing, in fact, the fishermen who've been obviously fishing and working on the water, right? And so to me, I thought this was really interesting about taking technology from, turn of the century in 1900 and creating, what I think is a beautiful image and one that obviously creatively used the limitations of photography to capture what I think is a really beautiful scene. And with that, guys, I will close and open it up for questions for everybody. No questions?
I think that means it was an excellent presentation.
They're speechless.
Thanks, Stacy.
We should mention, Mark, this exhibition has quite a few photographs in it. It takes up 3 floors of the Dubois Gallery in McGinnis Hall on Lehigh's campus. How many photographs would you say are in there? I can't remember now.
Oh my gosh, I would direct everybody to that, the resource on Art Store that you were telling them about, the downloadable thing. We are now at the close of this exhibition that's been up for a year, and it's many photographs. I can't estimate.
So I'm working on having some technical difficulties, but we will update our website exhibition page. And like I said, I will email out a PowerPoint of all the images, which includes the tombstone information about the photograph, who the photographer was, and title and all of that good stuff. We were asked if we could do a walkthrough Zoom to show the exhibition. Unfortunately, the challenge that we had with COVID didn't allow us to do some virtual photographs of the actual physical space. But I could quickly pull up the PowerPoint if you think that we have time and we would like to do that, Bob.
Sure, absolutely.
Okay, let me see.
If we get really lucky, before the show comes down, maybe we can do a a walkthrough video or something like that. But I don't know. It's going to be, it's so tricky because we don't know what our access is going to be to campus over the next.
Yeah, and I'll just say it's a very interesting space, right? It's a big open foyer, right, with 3 different levels, on 3 major walls at least, if not more. So I really enjoyed the space as well as the exhibit.
So I'm just going to tap through them. I did want to show you. So this is something that was very easy to export out of ArtStore. So if you go in there and you search within Lehigh University's collection and select images, you can export this onto your own computer or any pieces from our collection. And it brings all of this information in for you, which is really rich. And they're high resolution images. So, it helps for presentations or studies on your part. But we'll walk briefly through that, and then, we hope that you can come visit our spaces in the future. And you all can see this, yes?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, good. Mark, while we're kind of tabbing through, do you want to comment on how you and the curatorial team put together an exhibition and select works for thematic shows like this?
Sure. This one had a little bit of a history. I think, as I mentioned at the beginning, it developed out of a kind of teaching tool that was used by a class, and that's something that we are often engaged in as a university art museum. We're working with professors from all the departments at Lehigh to develop resources that they can use with their classes. And as you can imagine, there are many, many different kinds of touch points that works in a museum collection can attach to many different disciplines at the university. Obviously, these were developed for a photography class, but we just concluded a semester of working with students and faculty in history and political science, journalism, and communication to curate a show that is, fingers crossed, going up in the fall, called Doing Democracy, which is a selection of historical and political photographs, part of a gift given to the university by George Stephanopoulos. And so we actually ran a class, kind of co-taught by all of those disciplines that I mentioned, working with students to try to understand what an exhibition of those photographs might look like. So that was a great project. But curating a show, particularly at the university, we one of our missions is to show that art is always in dialogue with everything around it. And so we try to, develop exhibitions that are going to appeal to a broad audience and to make that connection as strongly as possible. I don't know if any of you had a chance to see our exhibition, The Crochet Coral Reef, by Margaret and Christine Wertheim and the Institute for Figuring in the main gallery at Zollner this past fall. But it was essentially a large sculptural coral reef constructed through the humble art of crochet, which magically is a technique that makes it easy to map these undulating forms that occur naturally in corals. So the show brought together, mathematics as well as marine biology, and a strong sense of craft and history of that area as well. So each show is a little bit different, and we draw on different resources. But our goal is always to connect and to connect ideas with people and and with as many subjects as possible. So in this exhibition, we began with a kind of starter set of works that Professor Anna Chupa had been using in her class. And then we did a deep dive into the collection using our collections database and really just looked for anything and everything in the collection that included water in any of its various states, as Bob mentioned, and and then from there we started to look at it. I think perhaps closer to along the terms that I talked about tonight, trying to find a variety of different compositional strategies and a variety of different ways that water was used by the photographer, different effects that would be of interest to students of photography as well as yourselves, as a teaching tool that students could come see the show and think about ways that they could be inspired and experience their own photography and have ideas. But then also just to show the range of the different ways that water could be used, right, as a subject, constantly flowing, changing, sometimes difficult to pin down subject. And it's so perfectly suited to the questions and problems of photography, right? What decisions do you make around freezing something or letting it blur? Or how close or far away are you? Is the water just a phenomenon, or is it a kind of metaphor or sort of social space like we saw with the kids in Cuba surrounded by the splashes of the waves? So we tried to find a balance between all of those different themes and aspects, and and the result is the exhibition that Stacy's scrolling through in the slideshow.
So I just reached the end. There are 50 images in this exhibition. Aesthetically, the compositional layout of it is really beautiful as well. So I will add those to the PowerPoint so you can see, the layout of the show. Just, it's obviously not the same on the computer as it is in person, but we're really working hard to find opportunities for you all to engage with our collection. As Mark said, we have some pretty wonderful shows coming up in the fall. We are finding out hopefully soon what Lehigh's decision is for reopening. So regardless, we will have some kind of combination of both online and in-person programming and exhibitions in the fall around doing democracy, as well as well, which is picturing wellness from our collection. And how artists approach mind, body, and spirit and wellness in their work, as well as a street photography exhibition called Taking It to the Street. So we're excited about opportunities to continue to partner with the Photography Club. Like I said, I will follow up with additional resources for all of you, including this presentation, so you can look at these images in more detail, and hopefully they'll inspire your own work. But please do visit our website, utilize our resources. There are tons of really wonderful videos, both created by students and faculty as well as artists. And we are always looking at ways to engage artists from the community in what we're doing. So stay tuned for opportunities to participate in social media, photography campaigns and things like that around doing democracy. But we are thrilled to begin this partnership with the Photography Club. We're thankful to all of you for joining us this evening, and for the wonderful presentations from Mark and Bob. We thank you very much. And with that, I think, we don't have any additional questions in the chat box unless anyone wants to unmute themselves. And
I'll just encourage everyone to join us again on the 23rd, when you'll have a further opportunity to tell us about what's going on at the university. And
Yes.
also, we've recorded this, and we'll make it available to all the club members, and a copy of this will also go to Mark and Stacy, and they can use it as is appropriate for the university.
Terrific.
Well, thank you. I know I learned a lot, and I'm looking forward to incorporating that into my own photographic work. So thank you.
Success.
I have a long way to go, though, I'm sure, compared to this group.
Well, we wish everybody a healthy and well week, and have a good evening for the rest of the evening, folks. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you all.
Thanks, everybody. Stay safe.